Hi, it's Miss Wilson, and I'm walking you through your introduction to A Midsummer Night's Dream. So let's get started. Midsummer Night's Dream is often credited with being written a year after, or at least first performed a year after Romeo and Juliet. So we see a lot of connections between Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, and his comedy, A Midsummer Night's Dream. There are two ways that critics talk about the Romeo and Juliet connection. One is some people talk about it as a criticism of Romeo and Juliet, that Midsummer Night's Dream exaggerates that young love, those courtly love ideals that we discussed with the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, but now we take them and we kind of make fun of them, and we take on farce, which is a lit term we'll be discussing in a minute, but we take on that idea and sort of look at the humor in it, especially if you're not one of those two lovers, either Romeo or Juliet. So if you're from the outside, then everything they say seems kind of ridiculous. Take him and cut him out in little stars seems just kind of over the top, especially if you're not Juliet and you're not feeling that emotion. But there's another way to look at A Midsummer Night's Dream, and that could be almost like Shakespeare writing an alternate ending to the play. So instead of having the tragic death of both Romeo and Juliet, and of course Paris, instead we give each lover someone that they can end up with happily ever after. So Romeo and Juliet, or in our play Hermia and Lysander, end up happily together, and Paris, or Demetrius, ends up happily with another young lady, Helena. So one way to look at it is a critique or criticism of plays like Romeo and Juliet that sort of have that exaggerated young love, courtly love ideals, or to see it as his sort of alternate ending to a play like Romeo and Juliet. So the one thing that we know for sure is that the play was written for a wedding, explores the ideas of love and marriage and the complexities of those relationships over time, that the longer you're with someone, the more you know about them, both good and bad, and how that kind of impacts both people in the relationship. We don't know what wedding it was written for, although Elizabethan historians or Shakespearean historians have kind of narrowed it down to a couple. But it doesn't really matter. What does matter is that it's a love story. There are some motifs that we're going to be looking for, and some of these are going to seem familiar because they're similar in, again, this is that idea that there is a connection between this play and Romeo and Juliet. The first one, though, we're going to be looking at is forbidden love. So we saw that in Romeo and Juliet. It's where daddy says no, but daughter says, I love him anyway. Then we have the idea of unrequited love, and that's where someone, that's sort of that love triangle where two people are in love, but the one person doesn't feel the same way about this third person, and then it gets kind of crazy from there. The unrequited love in our play, too, is going to lead to a little bit of some obsession and some just kind of, it's going to get interesting and comedic very quickly. Then we have the idea of complexity of love. So not only do we have two pairs of young lovers in our play, but we also have two pairs of older, one marriage that's getting ready to start between Theseus, who's the king of Athens, and Hippolyta, who's the queen of the Amazons. And then we also have the longer married couple of the king and queen of the fairies, so King Oberon and Queen Titania. We're going to be looking at perception versus reality. It's kind of right there in the title when you see that word dream. So we have sort of what we think to be real and what is real in the play. Those lines get blurred for some of the characters, and so it leads to sort of some interesting wake-up moments later in our play. Courtly love will be back with all three of its ideals, so we'll see idealization of the beloved, agony at being apart, and we'll also see an emphasis on innocence and purity. And as with all plays, especially those that we choose to read with teenagers, age and youth are going to come into it, so it may mean that you and I don't always agree on how we interpret characters based on our different perspectives on time. Gender roles also get explored in this play just like they did in Romeo and Juliet, so you'll see sort of, especially in Act 1, Scene 1, you're going to see that Aegeus, Hermia's dad, has more control over his daughter than he may if she were a son, and so we'll kind of see some of that. And we're also, of course, going to see light and dark. It's kind of in that third word of our title, that Midsummer's Night's Dream. So you're going to see that idea come back in here again. This one not so much with the idealization of the beloved, but kind of is more connected with that perception of perception versus reality. So what we think to be true and then what is actually true for the characters. Our big thing now is not just recognizing these motifs. Our big question while reading is not just can we recognize these motifs like we did with Romeo and Juliet? But now I want you to see if you can figure out what the message is about the topics. So taking the motif and turning it into a theme. So not just that we realize there is perception in reality, but why is Shakespeare writing that, and what is he trying to say about that, and how can we, how does that still apply, or does it still apply to a modern reader? And of course, you know it wouldn't be English class without some literary terms. So we're going to start with the new literary terms that I want to make sure you learn and look for as we're reading. So our first one is farce. This is the idea of a play or movie or story which has a lot of slapstick, which is exaggerated physical comedy. It kind of dwells in the ridiculous. So I've got a couple examples here you may be familiar with. The idea of Scary Movie, or one of my favorite, all-time favorite movies, What About Bob? Or the movie Vacation that came out last summer. This is the redo one, but they're all that idea of farce. Then we're going to be looking for aphorisms. These are sayings with a general truth, so there's something in the saying which does hold true. So you may have heard the saying, the family that plays together stays together. It's that short, kind of pithy, witty sentence that does have a general doctrine or truth to it. One of my favorites in our play is Lord, what fools these mortals be, or there's one in Act 1, Scene 1 that I want you to look for and see if you can find it as you're reading the homework. There are some literary terms again. This one is antithesis. This is when we're looking at the opposites in a single line or phrase. So one example is write quickly and you'll never write well. Write well and you'll soon write quickly. So we see how we switch those ideas there and there. I don't know why I'm pointing at the screen because you can't see me doing that. But the idea of quickly and you'll never write well. But if you write well, you'll soon write quickly. So we took that one idea from the first phrase and flipped it for the second one. That's antithesis. It's the opposite. Then we have conceits. A conceit, not conceited, but a conceit, when we're talking a literary term, is an exaggerated or an elaborate metaphor. You're familiar with one of these. This should look familiar from our play Romeo and Juliet. So when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun. It's that metaphor of comparing Romeo to the stars and to the nighttime, and that whole idea that it's exaggerated love, a very elaborate metaphor. That's a conceit. And our last new one, is epistrophe, and that's where we repeat the same word in consecutive lines or phrases. So you may be familiar with this. Hopefully you've never had to say this yourself in a courtroom, but I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And it's where we repeat that same word in consecutive lines or phrases. Don't forget these, guys. If you're unfamiliar with any of these, I need you to see me as soon as possible so that we can make sure you're familiar with them. So oxymorons, puns, comic relief, irony, metaphor, simile, allusion, soliloquy, monologue, aside, personification, figurative language. Your homework's on the screen, so get reading and we'll see you in class.